They called it socialism with a human face. For a few brief months in 1968, it felt like a promise, a communist country where writers could write, students could debate, newspapers could criticize, and no one would be dragged away in the middle of the night just for speaking their mind. It was happening not in Moscow or East Berlin, but in a small Central European country Americans rarely thought about, Czechoslovakia. And then, one August night, the sky filled with the sound of jet engines and the rumble of tanks. Within hours, hundreds of thousands of Warsaw-packed troops poured across the borders. Soviet armor rolled through the streets of Prague and Bratislava. The dream ended under steel tracks and heavy boots. In the chaos that followed, tens of thousands of Czechs and Slovaks, students, professors, journalists, engineers, faced a decision that would define the rest of their lives. Stay, bow their heads, and accept the new reality of normalization, or flee, risking prison, bullets, and treacherous mountain routes in an attempt to reach the free world on the other side of the Iron Curtain. This is the story of the Prague Spring escape. It is a story of desperate nighttime crossings through forests and hills, of families slipping over a militarized border, of young intellectuals stepping into a West they had known only from forbidden books and crackling radio broadcasts. And for American viewers, it is also a story about how these refugees saw the United States, its technology, its freedom, its way of life, and how that vision quietly terrified the men who sent those Soviet tanks in the first place. To understand why people risked everything in 1968, you have to understand what made the Prague Spring feel so different. After World War II, Czechoslovakia fell firmly into the Soviet orbit. A communist coup in 1948 brought a hardened Stalinist regime to power. Political trials, prison camps, and secret police surveillance crushed opposition. Writers knew which topics could get them banned. Professors knew which opinions could get them purged. Students knew that the safest way to graduate was to keep their heads down. By the mid-1960s, many inside the system could see that it was failing. The economy was stagnating, censorship was suffocating intellectual life. Even loyal communists began to argue that something had to change. In January 1968, Alexander Dubček became first secretary of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and launched a bold experiment, opening up the system from within. In a matter of months, restrictions on the press were relaxed. Critical newspapers and magazines appeared on kiosks. Writers published essays questioning past abuses. Students held open meetings on university campuses, debating Marxism, democracy, and the meaning of freedom. Television programs discussed topics that had been taboo for decades. The phrase "socialism with a human face" captured the mood of cautious hope. For American observers, it was a stunning development. In the heart of the Eastern Bloc, a communist country was trying to become more democratic without leaving Moscow's orbit. In Washington, analysts wondered whether this experiment might spread to Poland, to Hungary, even to the Soviet Union itself. In Moscow, the same thought filled party leaders with dread. Soviet officials watched the Prague Spring with increasing alarm. They saw uncensored newspapers, lively student debates, and open criticism of the party as the first cracks in a dam. If Czechoslovakia could loosen the screws and still call itself socialist, what would stop others from following? To them, this was not just about one small country. It was about the survival of their entire model and about the image of strength they projected to the world. On the night of August 20th, 21st, 1968, they made their choice. Roughly 170,000 soldiers from the Soviet Union and Allied Warsaw Pact states, supported by around 4,600 tanks and armored vehicles, crossed into Czechoslovakia. Their orders were clear: occupy key points, arrest reformist leaders, shut down independent media, and put an end to the Prague Spring. Czech and Slovak civilians poured into the streets, some trying to talk to the soldiers, others painting over street signs to confuse them. Radio stations improvised broadcasts as long as they could, urging people not to resist violently. There was no organized military defense, but there was shock, anger, and a sense of betrayal that spread like wildfire. Historians today estimate that at least 137 Czech and Slovak civilians were killed during the invasion itself, with around 400 deaths connected to the occupation in the following years. In the days after the tanks arrived, Dubček and other reformers were arrested and flown to Moscow. The message was unmistakable. The experiment was over. For the intellectuals and students who made the Prague Spring possible, the consequences quickly became clear. Censors returned to newsrooms, editorial boards were purged, university rectors were replaced. Writers, filmmakers, and professors who had supported the reforms were labeled as unreliable. The new leadership, under Gustav Husak, promised normalization, a return to strict control, enforced by the secret police. In that atmosphere, thousands of people realized they had a narrow window to escape before the regime tightened the border again. Some were already abroad when the tanks rolled in, at conferences, summer schools, or vacations in Western Europe. Many of them looked at the television images of armored columns in Prague and made a decision. They were not going back. Others were still at home, in cities and towns across Czechoslovakia, weighing the unthinkable, leaving family, language, and country behind for an unknown life in the West. The numbers give a sense of scale. Canadian records show that between 1968 and 1969, 14,374 people with Czechoslovakian citizenship entered Canada. Almost 12,000 of them were admitted under a special program for Prague Spring refugees. Studies of refugees in Austria report that around 162,000 Czech and Slovak crossed into Austria in the weeks after the invasion, with roughly 12,000 choosing to stay there permanently. The rest moved on to other countries, like Canada, the United States, West Germany, Switzerland, and the Nordic states. Behind each of those numbers was a journey, and for many, that journey began in the hills, forests, and backroads along the southern border with Austria. The line between Czechoslovakia and Austria was part of the Iron Curtain, a heavily controlled frontier that cut across villages, farms, and woods. In many sectors, it consisted of barbed wire fences, cleared strips of land, watchtowers with searchlights, patrols with dogs, and even in earlier years, minefields. It was designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep citizens in. For people trying to flee in late 1968, the safest routes were not the main roads. They were the forest paths and mountain trails, difficult terrain where border guards were fewer and visibility was lower. Students who had gone hiking in the Bohemian and Moravian highlands now turned that knowledge into survival. They studied maps, observed patrol patterns, and waited for bad weather or moonless nights to make their move. Imagine a group of university friends from Prague in 1968. They had spent the spring publishing a campus newspaper, debating politics in dorm rooms, and staying up late to listen to Western radio. After the invasion, the articles they wrote were used against them. One of them was questioned by the secret police. When rumors spread that the border might be soon sealed more tightly, they made a decision. They took a train as close as they dared to the border zone, then got off and walked. They carried small backpacks, some papers, a change of clothes, maybe a few photographs. Too much luggage would draw attention. They moved at night, following logging tracks through the woods. At each clearing, they went to their stomachs, scanning for towers or lights. Somewhere ahead, there would be fences and the stripped death strip of the Iron Curtain. Stories collected later from Czechoslovakian refugees in Austria and from oral histories paint variations on this scene, people crawling under or over multiple rows of barbed wire, cutting through with makeshift tools, or even using bad weather to cover the sound of their movements. Some were caught and sent back to face interrogation. Others slipped through and found themselves standing, exhausted and muddy, in a field or forest that looked much like the one they had just left, but on the Austrian side of the line. The border was not always crossed on foot. One now famous later escape, in 1986, saw two Czechoslovak men use improvised chairs on high-voltage power lines to cross above the Iron Curtain into Austria. Their daring method showed just how creatively determined some fugitives were to reach the West even years after the Prague Spring. While that specific case came later, it illustrates the larger pattern. When a system tries to close every door, desperate people will begin to look at walls, fences, and cables as potential escape routes. Most Prague Spring refugees, though, came by more conventional paths. Many drove to the border and then abandoned their cars before approaching the restricted zone on foot. Some traveled to Yugoslavia, where the regime was less tightly bound to Moscow, and from there moved on to Western Europe. Others, already abroad, simply stayed put. On the Austrian side, the response was swift. Though officially neutral, Austria had experience dealing with refugees from the Eastern Bloc. It had already received massive waves from Hungary in 1956. Once again, it set up reception centers and temporary camps, often in former military barracks or public facilities. There, Czechs and Slovaks were registered, given food and basic medical care, and interviewed about their plans. Studies of these refugees describe how in just a few weeks, about 162,000 people crossed from Czechoslovakia into Austria, and how around 12,000 decided to stay for the long term, forming a distinct community in and around Vienna. Many others moved on quickly, transferred by international agencies and government programs to Canada, the United States, and other Western countries that had agreed to share the responsibility. Canada played a particularly visible role. Shocked by the images of tanks in Prague and sympathetic to the idealism of the reform movement, the Canadian government created a special program to admit refugees from Czechoslovakia. Between 1968 and 1969, it brought in nearly 12,000 Prague Spring refugees under that scheme, out of a total of 14,374 Czechoslovak citizens admitted in that period. Many of them landed at the airport in Gander, Newfoundland, asking for asylum the moment they touched Canadian soil. The United States, too, saw strategic and moral value in accepting refugees from Czechoslovakia. American refugee policy during the Cold War placed a special emphasis on people fleeing communist regimes. Laws like the Migration and Refugee Assistance Act and later the 1980 Refugee Act gave U.S. presidents tools to admit and resettle those with a well-founded fear of persecution, including dissidents and intellectuals from Eastern Europe. Many Prague Spring exiles who ended up in North America were exactly the kind of people the United States valued: engineers, scientists, doctors, writers, artists, and students whose skills and experiences could easily be woven into an advanced industrial society. Research on post-1968 exile communities shows how these Czechoslovak refugees built new lives as professors, researchers, business owners, and professionals in their countries of asylum, while maintaining strong ties to their homeland through culture and politics. For American viewers today, it is easy to see the political symbolism. Here were people who had seen a reformed version of communism in action, had watched Soviet tanks crush it, and then voted with their feet to join the Western world. But for the refugees themselves, what they encountered in the United States and other Western countries was not just slogans about freedom. It was a daily, tangible experience of a different level of development. Consider one composite story built from patterns in the records. A young physicist from Prague spent part of the summer of 1968 at a scientific conference in Western Europe. He saw the news of the invasion on a black and white television in a hotel lobby. Soviet tanks in his hometown, crowds shouting in Czech, barricades in familiar streets. He called home. His parents told him to stay where he was. "There is nothing for you here now," they might have said. "Do your work. Be free." He applied for asylum and, after weeks of paperwork and vetting, was offered a research position in the United States. When he arrived, he found himself in a university laboratory equipped with instruments he had only read about: oscilloscopes, advanced computers for data analysis, access to the latest Western scientific journals. The budgets were larger, the bureaucracy was lighter, and the atmosphere was driven less by ideological slogans and more by competition and curiosity. Outside the lab, the contrast was just as sharp. Supermarkets with aisles of products, not bare shelves. Used cars that even a modest researcher could afford. Color televisions showing live images from around the world. America in the late 1960s and early 1970s was a society wrestling with its own conflicts, from Vietnam to civil rights. But it was also a society that had just put astronauts into orbit and was racing to land on the moon. For someone who grew up in a planned economy where consumer goods were scarce and travel tightly controlled, this was more than culture shock. It was proof that the propaganda he had heard back home, that the capitalist West was on the verge of collapse, that its technology was no match for the socialist camp, was simply not true. Every time he walked past a mainframe computer humming in its air-conditioned room or saw coverage of the Apollo program on TV, he was seeing the answer to a question that Soviet leaders wished no one would ask. Which system is really delivering progress? The Soviets themselves were painfully aware of this gap. Historians of the Cold War technology race have documented how by the late 1960s, the United States had pulled ahead decisively in areas like semiconductors, computers, and advanced manufacturing. The Soviet Union could launch powerful rockets and build nuclear weapons, but it struggled to replicate the quality, scalability, and consumer orientation of American technology. For them, every scientist or engineer who left the Eastern Bloc was not only a political embarrassment, but also a loss of valuable human capital. Czechoslovak refugees after the Prague Spring fit this pattern. Studies of their exile communities in Austria and Switzerland show that many were highly educated, with skills in engineering, medicine, and the humanities. And when they joined Western institutions and companies, they contributed to economies that were already outpacing the Soviet bloc. Their very presence in these settings undercut the Soviet claim that people in socialist countries were united, loyal, and convinced of their system's superiority. For the regime back home, the solution was twofold: close the exits and punish or silence those who stayed. In the years after 1968, the process of normalization in Czechoslovakia meant purging universities, media, and cultural institutions of Prague Spring supporters. Professors were demoted to teaching in remote schools or forced into manual labor. Journalists who had written bold articles in 1968 found themselves banned from the profession. Writers were no longer published under their own names. Students known for their activism were denied opportunities or pushed into marginal careers. The STB, the Czechoslovak secret police, watched those who remained, keeping files, tapping phones, and recruiting informers. People learned to speak in code, to trust only a small circle, to hide their true thoughts behind safe topics. For many, the departure of friends and colleagues into exile was both a source of envy and a painful reminder of their own constraints. At the same time, the exiles abroad were not simply disappearing into their new countries. They created publishing houses, cultural organizations, and political groups in places like Vienna, Zurich, Toronto, and Chicago. They wrote essays, gave lectures, and sometimes collaborated with Western media. Their voices helped shape how the wider world understood what had happened in Czechoslovakia and what life was like under normalization. For American audiences in the 1970s and 1980s, these stories added another layer to the image of the Cold War. It was no longer just about missiles in silos and summits in Geneva. It was about real people who had risked mountains, minefields, and border guards to leave a Soviet-dominated system and join a society that, for all its flaws, offered them tools, freedoms, and opportunities unimaginable back home. In a way, their journeys echoed the stories Americans already knew from World War II. People fleeing totalitarian regimes, finding refuge in the United States, and contributing to American science, culture, and industry. The difference now was that the enemy was not Nazi Germany, but the Soviet Union, and the tech gap was even more striking. Think about the message this sent across the Iron Curtain. A student in Prague in the late 1970s and 1980s might clandestinely listen to Western broadcasts, hear about a former classmate now doing research in Canada or teaching in an American university, and draw conclusions that no amount of official propaganda could erase. A young engineer in Bratislava, struggling with outdated equipment, might hear rumors of advanced Western computers and machine tools and understand, in a personal and painful way, that his country was falling behind. This is why stories of escape mattered so much to both sides. For the Soviet leadership and their Czechoslovak allies, each refugee was a symbol of disloyalty and a reminder that their citizens were not convinced. For the United States and its allies, each refugee, from the Prague Spring or any other uprising, was evidence that people behind the Iron Curtain knew the difference between the world they lived in and the world they wanted to live in. By the time the Velvet Revolution of 1989 swept away the communist regime in Czechoslovakia, many of the Prague Spring exiles had spent 2 decades abroad. Some returned, bringing back experience from Western universities, labs, and companies. Others stayed in their adopted homelands, but watched events in Prague and Bratislava with tears in their eyes. For them, the fall of the regime closed a circle that had begun on those dark August nights in 1968, when they chose to cross a line in the forest and step into the unknown. Looking back today, their escapes stand at the intersection of courage, geopolitics, and technology. They show what people will risk to control their own lives. They show how a single night of invasion can scatter a generation across continents. And they show how, in the quiet decisions of students, writers, and scientists to leave one system and join another, the wider story of the Cold War was being written, one border crossing, one laboratory, one classroom at a time. For an American audience, there's something deeply familiar in this pattern. It echoes the stories told about Germans and Americans in World War II, a powerful authoritarian regime, confident in its ideology, eventually forced to confront a rival that could out-innovate, out-produce, and out-inspire it. In the Cold War, the sight of Czechoslovak intellectuals and students choosing mountain trails and uncertain futures just to stand under Western streetlights was another reminder of that same truth. In the end, the Prague Spring escape is not just a story about a small country in Central Europe. It is a story about why people run towards certain flags, certain skylines, and certain futures when everything is on the line. It is about how, when the tanks of one system rolled into Prague, the ideas and people that system most feared slipped through the mountains at night and found their way to places where rockets were reaching the moon, computers were shrinking the world, and ordinary citizens could argue with their leaders without looking over their shoulder.